literally 40% of American citizens, when you take polls, this is the Pew Research Center, have no interest at all, don't care about democracy. They just want a strong leader to solve the issues.
When you get immigrants from a society where they believe that the Quran, which does not have the separation of church and state, where all Muslims are the Ummah, when they come to a largely secular society post 1648, post World War II, trying to create a liberal order with truth with a small t, and that clashes with truth with a capital T. And once economic turmoil hits, then you get the rise of the far right. And in a way, both Islamism and Islamophobia are going to remain in Europe. People's Liberation Army's Eastern Theater Command conducted a second day of large-scale Army, Naval, Air, and Rocket Force operations around Taiwan. And this is not just to the west of Taiwan, but also to the east of Taiwan, the Japan side of Taiwan. And Donald Trump's reaction at Mar-a-Lago was, I have a great relationship with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He hasn't told me anything about the drills and nothing worries me. The Indian economy, and we'll do a podcast on this shortly, faces meltdown because of a new form of socialism. Extreme oligopoly and tax terrorism. If you pursue any economic activity now, the government may just fleece you. And so, even though India has cheap labor, the cost of doing business, the transaction costs are so crazily high that you're better off going to Vietnam or elsewhere. Welcome to the December 2025 edition of FO Exclusive. Unlike the last 11 months of the year, and we're back, we will be looking forward. We will examine the world in 2026, or rather we'll conjure up the world in 2026. Predictions are a fool's business, but both of us take after Don Quixote. We are both fools. We will tilt at the windmills. And today we are going to use a framework that might scandalize some of you. It's called SPERM. No, it does not stand for what Donald Trump or Elon Musk or Boris Johnson would imagine. SPERM stands for social, political, economic, religious, and military factors. So the first issue we are going to pick up is going to be social. And issue number one is immigration will be a hot ticket issue around the world. Political factors. Number two, the issue number two will be US democracy faces a systemic challenge. Under the political rubric, issue number three will be the far right will become stronger in Europe. Under the economic rubric, issue number four will be increasing strains leading towards global recession. Issue number five under the economic rubric is global race for critical minerals. Now, there are two issues which combine social, political, economic, and religious. Issue number six, Europe faces a mega poly crisis. Issue number seven, instability on the rise, failing, flailing, and fracturing states. Now, finally, the military rubric, issue number eight, Russia-Ukraine war comes to an end. And issue number nine, last but not the least, tensions turning dangerous in East Asia. So we are now going to...
I'm sorry, Atul, to jump in, but although we have an overambitious agenda per usual already, I would add a 10th one, or at least another element under the military, and that is Israel, Gaza, Israel, the Middle East, Iran, and changing factors in the Middle East.
And the Middle East never ceases to surprise, does it? All right. So issue number one, immigration will be a hot ticket issue around the world. This is under the social rubric. And immigration is an issue that has taken center stage. US President Donald Trump won in part because he promised to secure America's borders. The British voted for Brexit to take back control, especially of the UK's borders. In France and Germany, immigration is now a central issue. Now, before you start thinking what's happening with all these Western countries, the third world countries are also concerned about immigration. Pakistan is packing off millions of Afghans to Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. Note that Germany and France note that the UK and even the US are not doing it. India is worried about Bangladeshis flooding in and changing the demography of parts of the country. Operation Dudula, a vigilante movement in Soweto, South Africa, is hunting down illegal immigrants, especially children, children who are going to schools funded by South African taxpayers. So the issue is global. But the issue is especially relevant to the West because people from what Donald Trump calls shithole countries want to move to more posh parts of the world. And indeed, in rich countries, women are not having babies. So you do need some cheap labor, ideally some skilled labor as well. Anyway, let's get to some numbers. The US, as of January 2025, 53.3 million immigrants, the largest number ever recorded, live in the US. Live in the US, forming 15.4% of the population. So 53.3 million immigrants, 15.4% of the population. In the UK,
if I could just jump in for a second on that, what contributes to making the American circumstances distinctive, unusual, since we all imagine, rightly, America as a nation of immigrants, is that immigration in the United States, although it had similar percentages of foreign-born to native-born residents 125 years ago, roughly speaking, immigration essentially stopped with World War I until 1965, after which and since which it has exploded. And so America is re-experiencing what it had not for two generations. And 4 generations ago, when we last had this level of population, we had a surge of nativist, racist, white supremacist political parties and social movements. And what are we experiencing now?
So, UK. At the time of the 2021-2022 census, the UK had 10.7 million immigrants, about 16% of the population. Both the numbers and the percentage have gone up since. In France, conservative estimates put the range from 10.3 to 13.8% of the population. In Germany, in 2024, there were 17.4 million immigrants, representing 20.9% of the population. This country is the largest destination for immigrants in the EU. And I'll repeat, 20.9, that is more than 1 out of 5. In the Netherlands, as of January 1, 2025, as per their website, their census website, there are more than 3 million immigrants out of a total of 18 million people, 16.8% of the population. So, what do we have? Europe has aging populations and falling birth rates, declining demographics. Therefore, on the one hand, it needs immigrants. However, immigration is causing challenges with assimilation. The factor of Islam in a Western secular society, where in some people's words, the 7th century confronts the 21st century, causes other problems. On the one hand, some people say Islamism is a problem, and those include people in intelligence agencies. And then there are others, the liberals, who believe Islamophobia is a problem. So Islamism and Islamophobia versus Islamophobia is defining the narrative wars in Europe. In a nutshell, immigration is a divisive issue worldwide. Over to you, Glenn.
Sure. Just for a moment, an issue that I was going to say America has struggled with, but that's not really the case. The way America has addressed the issue of nationhood, of what American civilization is, what the culture is, what the country means, what it means to be someone within the United States, is that one holds allegiance to an ideal, a series of ideals. Europeans and non-Americans in general tend to marvel at how ubiquitous the American flag is everywhere, and you think, well, what is all that about? And what it really represents is the idea of America, and that is a largely liberal in the small, in the philosophical sense, political sense, uh, subscription to democracy, individual rights, secular humanism, which I will affirm with tremendous pride. And fundamentally, what that means is that the public space has to accept, tolerate fundamentally divergent views. So truth becomes personal and relative to a certain extent. That's the whole point. Now, that is being challenged when you have large numbers of immigrants who, for whatever reasons, seem not to, or explicitly do not, subscribe to the ideals. And then there becomes pressure for a blood and soil kind of definition of citizenship, of nationhood, which is you are where you were born or who you are ethnically and religiously. And that is the model that historically has obtained in most countries at most times, but actually is not compatible to the point where it is renders impossible a pluralist democracy to function. And that's fundamentally the issue, even though the average person doesn't articulate that or is even aware of that. That's what's underpinning or underlays this increasing roiling strife and crises in all of the democracies. So what's the consequence in the forecast we can try to make for all of this pressure of immigration and social change and strain? I think with some confidence we can say that the parties of the far right will continue to thrive. They are a reaction against these pressures and these changes and the challenges to what it is to be a citizen in one country or another. And that the democratic processes of the countries experiencing these changes, and that's most, will continue to fray. And social unrest, tensions, resentments will remain a growing driver in the political processes of progressively troubled democracies.
Indeed. And as we said, once you get a large number of people who believe in truth with a capital T, and remember, a lot of the religious wars in Europe were over the question of religion. It's easy to forget that now, but what the torch that Martin Luther lit in 1517 only subsided in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia and the modern nation state project. And when you get immigrants from a society where they believe that the Quran, which does not have the separation of church and state, where all Muslims are the Ummah, when they come to a largely secular society post 1648, post World War II, trying to create a liberal order with truth with a small t, and that clashes with truth with a capital T. And once economic turmoil hits, then you get the rise of the far right. And in a way, both Islamism and Islamophobia are going to remain in Europe. In a way, the US has it better because in US, you do not have the same degree of historical animus that immigrants sometimes bring to Europe, the former colonies coming to, as in France, the colonial masters. So immigration...
Well, I think Yeah, I think I'll take a little issue with that, or give a different coloration to the point, because that leads to something I wanted to add before we move on to the next subject, and I don't want to take too much time. But Americans have forgotten, misunderstood, papered over, and interpreted in a rather Pollyanna-ish way today American history. And whereas one thinks, well, the religious wars were the European crisis, or they are the crisis of the West and Islam, or Christianity based originated societies in Islam. That's true, but it misses the one of the deep truths shaping American history, political and social, and that is the religious clash in the American context between Protestant and Catholic. That determined American history from the time of the Mayflower until certainly independence, because there was the struggle between Protestant England and Catholic France and Spain for domination of the continent. And then since then, Americans have tended to forget, because if we say, oh, it's a separation of church and state, and the religious issues aren't the problem. No nativist American of English or Protestant origin disliked the Irish immigrants because they were Irish. The issue was that they were largely Catholic, and the original settlers who dominated were English, Scottish, Protestant. That shaped American politics decisively, arguably up to the present day, but certainly until about 1960, when John F. Kennedy crossed a lot of thresholds and changed many things. So this is this religion and its effects on society, and therefore its effects on the viability and successfulness of democracy, is the driving underlying force.
All right. So now that you've mentioned Kennedy, let's move to the political rubric. Issue number 2, US democracy faces a systemic challenge. Now, very quickly before you launch on this, Glenn, because you understand this better. After all, you are the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I'm a mere foreigner by origin. But what we are noticing is over the years, there has been a breakdown of the legislative branch of the government. The record government shutdown for 43 days is a case in. Why did it happen? Because the US Congress failed to pass a budget for the new financial year that begins on September 1st. Like other legislatures, the US Congress has the power of the purse. It approves appropriations from the US Treasury. In an ideal world, the Congress would pass the budget and the federal government would function smoothly for the year. Since the start of the 21st century, Congress has not met the appropriation deadlines and authorized most federal funding through a continuing resolution, CR. Now, a CR provides temporary financial coverage for government programs until a regular appropriations bill is passed. The fact that Congress cannot even pass a budget is very worrying. Now, this breakdown is a symptom. It's a symptom of extreme polarization. Republicans view Democrats as woke totalitarians. Democrats view Republicans as racist fascists. The US, to quote a great man sitting with me, is more divided than at any other time since 1861, since the Civil War. Glenn has said this ad nauseum. He's made the argument that the division is greater than the 1960s and 1970s. And what has transpired because of this legislative breakdown, or perhaps or led to it in part, it's a radical increase in executive power. And a lot of people have warned about an imperial presidency, especially constitutional law scholars. They talked about giving the incumbent of the White House a loaded gun because of the increase in executive orders, executive privilege, emergency powers, and agency rulemaking. All of these were used to bypass congressional gridlock. George W. Bush used it. during the during the global war on terror, which Glenn knows really well, and we have a couple of podcasts on this, the neoconservatives engaged in a power grab and justified torture. Now we have the theory of unitary executive. The president is certainly a king, if not an emperor. Over to you, Glenn.
Well, I'll say something perverse intentionally. If there was any silver lining to America's abiding original sin and struggle with slavery and its legacy, it was that for a century, after having divided and just about destroyed the nation from even before its birth, there was a compromise between conservative Southerners who were white and social the working class of whites in the North created the Democratic Party, and you had a compromise coalition that caused moderating policies on the whole, and avoided a polarization on sectional, regional, or policy lines. That all broke down happily in some ways with the progressive successes of the civil rights movement, which really took off after World War II and during my lifetime from the mid-50s up until today. And the consequences of that success and triumph and progressive realization of the American ideal of all men are created equal is the polarization of the political process. What that has done is to empower one of the original strains, strain as in currents, in American society, which is nativist, racist, white supremacist, frankly, hostile to immigrants, isolationist, and in many ways fundamentally anti-democratic. And that has all come to reside, all of those forces and perspectives to reside in the Republican Party. And as immigration has joined the civil rights movement from the mid-60s on, that has empowered, given focus for the resentments and the objectives of this conservative political faction. And you thus have a polarization of American society, the American political process, and now the American government, so that the moderating democratic norms that were made more possible because of obligatory compromise within our political system now no longer moderate themselves or the process. And we're finding that Americans are discovering that literally 40% of American citizens, when you take polls, this is the Pew Research Center, have no interest at all, don't care about democracy. They just want a strong leader to solve the issues and to give the appearance, at least, and I'm not being facetious, of making America strong. And so this is what's happening. What's the consequence of these recent trends? Well, I think the centralization of power and the erosion of the checks and balances that kept that in check for 2 centuries will probably prove lasting, meaning that you can't really undo some of the things that have the centralization that has occurred. It's easy to break something. It's very hard to put it back together, especially a social consensus that was always papered over, really, rather than existent and real in the first place. And this is all true even though a strong majority of American citizens oppose the changes that we're experiencing. And even though some remediation or change going back to the status quo ante of a more functioning democracy is possible.
All right. Issue 3, under the political rubric, the far right will become stronger in Europe. European democracies are facing political gridlock. In very few countries, a single party or a bloc has a clear majority. Even in the UK, which is out of the EU but still in Europe, Labour's 2024 loveless landslide has failed to provide a decisive or effective government. Nigel Farage's irresistible rise is causing alarm in many circles and much glee in other circles. Let's look at the French Parliament, talking about gridlock. The French Parliament has 3 amorphous blocs, and they cannot agree upon anything. French lawmakers were unable to agree upon a budget in 2026.
Why is that any different from before?
Indeed.
I'm sorry.
And they passed a stopgap measure to keep the government running into January with 2025 spending levels. In a nutshell, Peter Isaacson, our wonderful colleague at Fair Observer, who's written quite a few pieces for us, in a nutshell, he said France is now ungovernable. It's too divided. Now let's move from France to Germany, the other great power in the EU, the other great power of Europe, the heart of Europe, the engine of Europe. And there you have the alternative für Deutschland, AfD, on the rise. In a late November event at Glessen, a student town near Frankfurt, speakers of AfD's youth wing, Generation Germany, urged mass remigration of foreigners away from Germany. Clearly, they are taking lessons from Pakistani generals.
Oh my God.
It's not just Germany that is going through, or maybe lessons from their past as well. But if you look at Hungary, Slovenia, and Czechia, all of them are led by far-right governments. Italy, Finland, and Croatia have far-right parties in the government. In fact, Italy's leader, who's now very popular and is pretending to be a moderate, began as a far-right leader. And rumor has it that her deputy prime minister, when he opens the door and welcomes you in his house, you greet him and a bust of Benito Mussolini above, saying hello as well. So Italy, has always had a little bit of a fascination. Italy has always had a fascination for good old Benito, but Italy, is an example of that. Okay, maybe the far right won't be so bad, but the far right is now in power in a coalition, but it is in power. Even Sweden, the Pollyannish wonderland that Democrats want to convert America into. Even Sweden has a coalition government which depends on the support of which depends on the support of the populist Sweden Democrats. So,
if I could just jump in for 1 second, Atul, Sweden is an interesting case because, as you say, all of our lives, our generation, everywhere has viewed Sweden and the Scandinavian countries as these progressive, tolerant winter wonderlands. And there's a lot of truth to that, but there's a lot of blindness to that also. Sweden had a very strong current of support for far-right fascistic views up through World War II, certainly, in a very similar way to the currents that I just talked about with regard to the United States. So Western societies, I think all societies, are far more tribally based than our conventional views concerning progressive democracies would have us think consciously. And that fundamentally, the tribalism, fundamentally explains the millennia of religious struggles, as well as the ethnic racial struggles, all related to immigration and the political crisis of democracy, specifically in Europe you're talking about.
Yeah, and in Europe, we have increasing economic pain. We have growing democratic dysfunction. We have declining demographic trends, and rising immigration. So obviously, this is going to benefit the far right. In fact, a polycrisis is brewing, and we'll talk about that more about that later. The point I made earlier about the religious wars, and if we go on from the religious wars, we had nationalism take off after the French Revolution, and then once that happens, you get national wars, and they only end with World War II. And so, in a way, Europe has had a few decades of peace as an aberration. The rise of our right in some ways is maybe a reversion to mean what's new.
Yes. I am left literally speechless. I think it's more and more striking to me that we are stripping away against many people's wills, some of our myths and delusions, and some of our beliefs about the foundations of what makes a national sentiment or nationalism. What is nationalism really but another version of tribalism? It all comes down to in-group, out-group, tribal behavior. But the consequence of all this is that Europe seems to be facing an accumulating existential democratic challenge. The far right, the nativist right anyway, is likely to continue growing in strength for the foreseeable future, which means that democratic norms and practices and structures will continue to be come under greater strain and possibly dysfunction. And then European integration and Europe's international alliances, which largely means NATO, but there the responsibility lies in Washington more than in Europe, will also continue to struggle as far as we can see in the future.
All right, we move to the economic rubric, and the economic rubric issue 4. Under the economic rubric, issue 4 is increasing strains towards global recession. Now, here we are being a bit contrarian. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said, I think 2026 can be a very good year. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, a wonderful name, a glorious name, the best ever that you can imagine, is a tax-cutting law enacted in July. It'll soon have effects. Americans will receive refunds that reflect retroactive tax cuts on income from 2025. They will also find that levies on monthly earnings have fallen. According to Piper Sandler, an investment bank, these 2 years of tax cuts in one are worth about $191 billion. So you'll get a big fiscal cannon going off. Not just that, a monetary cannon is also likely to go off. In 2024, the Fed cut rates thrice. In 2025, the Fed held its fire or didn't drop rates, despite pressure from Donald Trump. But in September, October, and December, the Fed has cut rates this year, and it has cut rates to limit job losses. Over 1 million people lost their jobs in the worst year for layoffs since 2009. So I was looking at some numbers, and I was looking at numbers for layoffs by year. And in 2020, over 2 million people lost their jobs. In 2001, nearly 2 million people lost their jobs. In 2002, the number was 1.3 plus 1.373, if or basically nearly 1.4 million. In 2009, it was over 1.2 million. And in 2025, when we've not had a financial crisis, unlike 2007, 2008, we've already lost a million nearly a million and 171,000 jobs. That's a big figure. Despite that, the GDP is soaring, and it rose 4.3% in the third quarter. Goldman Sachs expects, quote, sturdy global growth of 2.8% in 2026 versus a consensus forecast of 2.5%. The US is likely to outperform substantially, 2.6 versus 2%, unquote. So basically, Goldman Sachs expects slower but solid growth to continue in 2026 because of three reasons: reduced tariff drag, tax cuts, i.e. fiscal policy, easier financial conditions, i.e. monetary policy. And the Goldman Sachs estimates for the US economy, quarter one, 3.5%, quarter two, 2.5%, quarter three, 2.1%, quarter four, 2.1%. These are its forecasts for 2026. Now, the Fed will have a new chair in May, and it's likely to be someone Donald Trump likes and US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent likes. So we are probably going to have a looser monetary policy. So given all of that, things should be fine. I mean, we should carry on. However, even Goldman Sachs foresees a big risk.
Before you get to the backside covering aspect of Goldman Sachs's presentation and assessment, listening to the Secretary of Treasury say everything will be great is a little bit like listening to a used car salesman assuring you that the car is fine. I mean, are you a fool or are you not a fool? And if you want to buy a car that makes any sense, do you listen to the car salesman or do you take it to a garage for an assessment by somebody independent before you fork over your money?
Surely Goldman Sachs is independent. Surely.
It's sort of a simple thing to do. Furthermore, the Goldman Sachs's GDP projections, I think, are quite similar to Michael Bloomberg and me, rather. Both of us are graduates of Johns Hopkins, and between us, we have given over $100 million to Johns Hopkins University. He gave $100 million, and I have given $5 million. So my statement is literally true, and it's completely nonsensical. It's misleading. It's duplicitous. It's actually shameful. And we'll get to some of the, I think, deeper fundamentals that none of this seems to be touching upon, but carry on.
Well, so Goldman Sachs says the main vulnerability remains a crack in the US labor market. If job softness tips into a zone where recession becomes a serious prospect again. It's very much cover your ass territory. And we take a view more steeped in history. The big trends since 2016, since Donald Trump first came to power, are, number one, mercantilism and protectionism. That is something Donald Trump has been consistent on since the 1980s when he targeted Japan. And then, of course, everything he said about Japan, you could just replace Japan with China and add a little bit more.
That is literally a true statement. That is not, you are not being in the least reductionist or facetious. That is literally true. You change the word Japan to China or Europe, and you change the date, perhaps, and it's what Trump says is verbatim what he said in the 1980s.
So number one, mercantilism and protectionism. Number two, tax cuts and rising deficits, which, shall we say, are also lead to rising debt. and American debt as a percentage of GDP is exceeding Greece's. So worrying trends
and lead to
indeed.
rising interest rates.
Yes.
And lead to
number
lower
three,
growth.
yes. And number three, monetary pump priming through basically using both monetary and fiscal levers, because it's the midterm in 2026. We are seeing a return to pump priming, which many governments practiced, particularly in the aftermath of World War II until the 1970s, when you had a move towards independent central banks and economic governance that was less timed according to election cycles. Number four, more mergers and acquisitions than previous years. Number five, increased market distortions. Number six, a K-shaped recovery. And those of you who know about a K-shaped recovery, I mean, the upper classes or the wealthier sections of society experience a boom, and those at the bottom have a drop off. That's a K-shaped recovery. Now, we don't have time to dive into this in detail. We'll do it in a deeper podcast. Listen to the dialectic, where we cover issues in much greater detail. But the important thing is that all of these will combine to slow down growth, and all of these will cause the risk of recession to go up. Now, important thing to remember here is that let's touch upon a couple of data points very quickly, and then I'll hand it over to Glenn. According to the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, the 2025 M&A deal volume in the US reached approximately 2.3 trillion. This is up 49% from 2024. And the global M&A deal volume is expected to increase by over 25%. So we've had very large M&A deals in the US, $40 billion plus deals to date, and there were zero such deals in 2024. So what we are seeing is this reemergence of the mega deal. And that is always a worrying sign of a frothy market. That means that the animal spirits have gone a little too crazy. Now, worldwide, there were 63 deals worth 10 billion or more. This exceeds the prior annual high set a decade earlier. Global private equity deal volumes reached 2 trillion by the end of 2025, a high since the banner year COVID era 2021. So there are fears that the market may be a little too frothy. There are fears of an AI bubble bursting. There has been $350 billion of capital expenditure in AI. 100 billion of this is debt. This is 3 times the average of the previous 9 years. There have been incestuous circular deals. What do I mean by that? NVIDIA invested in OpenAI, then OpenAI bought NVIDIA chips for computing power. This is a little too incestuous. Valuations are looking expensive. The S&P is trading at 31 times earnings. This PE ratio is certainly not as high as the 2001 bubble, but it is getting there. And perhaps
historically, average price and earnings ratios have been about 20. So it is alarming.
Yeah. And maybe it's also, we are overdue a correction, because we've had high returns for 3 consecutive years, 24% in 2023, 23% in 2024, and 17% in 2025. The fact that the music, the notion that the music will keep playing seems to be slightly optimistic. One of our friends, in fact, we have many friends who are investors. Our editor-at-large, Alex Gloy, a German economist, has been one of our friend philosophers and guides, helps us come to better judgment. But this is not his remarks. This is another savvy investor. He said, fine, you're investing all of this. Where are the new business models and the flowing revenue streams from this new AI. Also, in November, both Glenn and I raised this issue and pointed to everyone that bank bosses to IMF economists are warning about stratospheric valuations of America's tech companies. For instance, for companies to achieve a 10% return on AI capex by 2030, they will need 650 billion of annual AI revenues. This is close to $400 per year from every iPhone user. So the US economy has major risks. Things are not looking good. And we are seeing job losses, and we are seeing dangerous fiscal and monetary loosening. Other economies also face risk. Chinese factories are running far short of capacity. Demand continues to be weak. Unemployment remains high. EU economies with aging populations, low demand, high unemployment, large debts, and low productivity face crisis. The Indian economy, and we'll do a podcast on this shortly, faces meltdown because of a new form of socialism. Extreme oligopoly and tax terrorism. If you pursue any economic activity now, the government may just fleece you. And so even though India has cheap labor, the cost of doing business, the transaction costs are so crazily high that you're better off going to Vietnam or elsewhere. So manufacturing in India has cratered, and so has demand, and talent and capital is fleeing India. So if you start looking at the big drivers of the global economy, the question arises, where will growth come from? Over to you, Glenn, after such grim news and so many bad numbers, and what do you have to say?
I think the numbers are worse than what you've been saying, because what you've been saying just now, not that you were wrong, is that you have been iterating for us what the government officials, in particular in the United States, have been saying about the rosy economic circumstances. The facts, I think, are substantially different, or the understanding of them should be substantially different. So the stock market growth, most of us probably have heard, if not, we all should, that I believe 60% of the stock market's increase, is because of the 5 AI leading investing research companies. For the rest of the market, the Standard & Poor's 500 in the United States context, the market has been essentially flat for several years. When you look at unemployment being still low, and I'll take the counter position to your enumeration of the annual job losses, is that there have been job creations at the same time, and unemployment remains low, but I don't think that is the leading indicator. That's the indicative data point we should look at. What we should look at really is that we should take a lesson from orchard growers in Western Massachusetts in 1981. I'm sure you all are intimately aware of that story. The story is that Massachusetts doesn't have much agriculture compared to states where that's more central for their economies, but it has some. It has apple orchards in the west of the state. In the fall of 1981, it was harvest time, and the apple growers needed labor to pick the apples. And unemployment at the time was something like 13%. I don't know. It was very high. And they could not get Americans to accept the jobs. So they had a choice. Either the apples rot and they go bankrupt, or they find labor somehow. And what did they do? They literally flew in Haitian day laborers who were willing to work. And that saved the orchard and the harvest and the jobs at the cost of low-cost immigrant labor. What's happening now? Illegal immigration is really is the lowest that has been in many years. One can praise this. But the reality also is that 40 years ago, it was actually 44 years ago, when the last close call for reaching an immigration reform act occurred, the deal was scotched by two factions, one Republican and one Democrat. The Democrats insisted that there be labor guarantees for all employees, whether they were legal or illegal, and the Republicans refused that. And the Republicans insisted that there be exceptions made for day laborers to support the agricultural industry of the Southwest of the United States. And so there was no immigration reform, so that immigrants could continue to pick the strawberries and Americans could have low-priced food. All of that is changing now, but you will not have as labor conducted at as lower cost, so that will be inflationary, and you will struggle in America to find enough hands willing to do the jobs that now are not being filled. So the pressures on employment are contradictory, but they will be inflationary, and unemployment will go up because interest rates will go up as the deficit is increasing, which will crowd out opportunities for expenditure by the government at the same time. Furthermore, these rosy GDP figures that are given are quite misleading, because where is literally the overwhelming majority of expenditures coming from? It's coming from the top 5%, even top 1% of the economic structure of America, the richest
very
1
quickly,
or 5%.
If I can jump in, this is what economists call the K-shaped recovery. And what is a K-shaped economy? What is a K-shaped economy? When you have, shall we say, the top or the wealthy elements in society, when they have strong spending, they have wealth growth, and they are driving demand. But the bottom part, the lower and middle income people, they struggle with inflation, they struggle with debt, wages are stagnant, they are experiencing a cost of living crisis.
They have no money to spend.
Exactly.
They have no money to spend. And then you add to that, literally, they have no money to spend. Why was Trump reelected? He was reelected for two reasons, really. We've harped on the immigration issue, which is the social issue, one. The second one is, I think the expression used by the media now is economic anxiety. It's people are feeling the pinch, and it's not the bottom 10% who always struggle terribly. It's now that the bottom is the bottom 80% of the population, which has been in economic stasis for a decade or longer, not seeing any real sustained growth in their disposable income. That is made worse. Choose one item economically, let's say tariffs by random choice, which seem to be averaging now a 15% increase across the board. The consequences are categorical. I mean, there's no debate about this unless one listens to a fool or a liar. I'm sorry. If you raise tariffs by 15%, then those products imported either will cost 15% more. I'll simplify just a little bit, or the importing companies that sell them, such as Amazon, say, will have to swallow a 15% reduction in their revenue, their profits, because they will have to pay it. Foreigners do not pay tariffs. They pay nothing. They receive income from selling their goods. So what will that have as an effect? It will increase prices. Tariffs can also have the effect of increasing domestic employment, but as those who have studied basic economics will learn, goods that have to be produced as substitutes will be less efficient, meaning they will cost more to produce. Americans will spend more money to produce a bottle of wine than someone from Portugal or South Africa, because labor costs are higher. taxes affect the businesses more directly, and so on. So you can have American wine substituting for Portuguese wine, but the cost on the whole will be higher to the consumer, which means consumers will have less money to spend in general for things, which means that demand will go down and so will the standard of living. One can go on and on and on. The point is that the economic fundamentals in the United States, and the United States remains the engine of the world economy, are less rosy and trending far worse than one hears conventionally. I am not predicting a recession in the next 6 months, but at some point the water does spill over the top of the glass, and then you have one. And that's what I would say is happening. So to me, the consequences, I think, are that
Glenn, before you carry on, just
the global economy.
Glenn, before you carry on, just 2 data points to support you. Our sources in finance point to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's quarterly report on household debt and credit. In the third quarter, roughly 4.5% of household debt was at least 30 days delinquent. This is the highest since early 2020 when COVID hit. In addition, student loan delinquencies jumped to 14.4%, the most on record. So what you say about people not having money is backed by this report. Over to you.
Yeah, I think we know many of us have heard the shocking statistic that I think reveals the hollowness of the richest country on earth, but of all economies, frankly, that the average American family does not have $400 of disposable income to meet an unexpected expense, such as a fender bender accident or a visit to the hospital because you stumbled on a curb and broke your elbow or something. That's a shockingly tenuous and fragile economic and social world. And so my sardonic remark about how Michael Bloomberg and I have contributed over $100 million to Johns Hopkins, it's true. What it implies or illustrates about the American economy. Elon Musk contributed roughly $300 million to a political campaign. I contributed more than most Americans, probably a couple $100. These imbalances have economic consequences, then social consequences, and then political consequences. And that's what will happen this year.
Brilliant. Okay. We'll now speed up. Issue number 5, under the economic rubric, the global race for critical minerals. Now, we think global race for critical minerals will heat up, and we think that is going to happen because China's near control over many critical minerals and rare earth elements caused alarm. Why? Because during the trade war, Beijing weaponized that dominance during trade negotiations. Both the US and the EU are worried about dependence on China and future supply shocks. You'll find talk about supply chain security anywhere you go. The US has launched a more muscular industrial policy through domestic and allied investment to resist coercion, price manipulation, and supply chain disruption. So what we expect is that starting 2026, you will see both the great powers, US and China, go head to head around the world, and others will try to secure the supply chains too. The US Geological Survey most recent list has 60 minerals and rare earth elements as critical to national and economic security. These critical minerals are often highly concentrated. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is home to more than 70% of the world's cobalt supply. So perhaps Cold War II might shift out to DRC. Similarly, Venezuela, which is in the news, has some critical minerals. And there have been executive orders galore in the Trump administration, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, the Export-Import Bank, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. They've all been backing development of critical minerals. And of course, the White House has pursued bilateral and multilateral agreements, and we've had deals with, for instance, Australia, and we've had the Critical Minerals Action Plan agreed at the Group of Seven Summit in June. We've also had the Quad Critical Minerals Initiative, and so on and so forth. Over to Glenn for consequences and forecast.
Well, I guess rare minerals are today's version of oil, I suppose, or uranium. Oh, that's a rare mineral. And it can drive geopolitics and certainly shape the economy, and pretty well guaranteeing clashes. But in any event, these two lines of effort, I think, will continue to shape the Trump administration's and China's, therefore the world's diplomacy and industrial policies this year. How this will affect overall supply and therefore the growth rates of the cutting edge industries, I think is uncertain. I'm relatively optimistic that demand will find greater supply if China restricts it. That's historically been the case everywhere. We're hearing of
especially over time,
discoveries in lithium in Latin America. But certainly it's one of the driving forces, it will be, for 2026, economically, politically, geopolitically, and politically in domestic context too.
All right. Now we are going to look at social, political, economic, and religious factors, or together. Under this rubric, issue number 6, Europe faces a mega polycrisis. And we expect Europe to be in crisis in 2026. We've mentioned political paralysis that exists both domestically and the European level. We saw this entire convoluted negotiations over a loan to Ukraine divide Europe terribly. On the one side, Germany wanted to not just to freeze the assets, definitely, which they did through a special procedure, but they also wanted to use those assets to give a loan to Ukraine, because of course the EU economies themselves are under fiscal duress. But there was acute resentment from Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, or the Czech Republic, Belgium, which didn't want this. In fact, Italy, Bulgaria, and others didn't want it either. So at the European level, at the level of the EU, things are fractious. Domestically, we've already talked about the divisions. There's, of course, a looming sovereign debt crisis. Now, that debt crisis can be solved, but at the moment, there's no domestic agreement in many countries. The Netherlands doesn't even have a government right now. They're still in talks to have a government. And so this inability to act is going to accelerate the looming sovereign debt crisis, asphyxiating red tape. Doing anything in Europe has become increasingly difficult. You have to run from pillar to post to get anything done, and European leaders themselves have acknowledged it. Olaf Scholz acknowledged it in Parliament, in the German Parliament, the previous Chancellor. The French acknowledge it. The Dutch have a term for poldering, that nothing really gets done. Everyone keeps talking. Europe is in a low productivity trap. Europe is struggling to attract talent. In the words of a CDU MP, CDU is the ruling party of Germany, it's a center-right party. And he said, look, we have immigrants who are not productive. We've taken too many refugees. They are low skill, low productivity labor. We cannot attract the sort of talent that the US attracts. And ideally, we should just target the top 25 universities outside the West and bring talent over to Europe the way US used to, given the US immigration policy. but we somehow can't do that yet. We are paralyzed. And this is a member of the ruling party talking to me, obviously off the record. I don't want to end his political career.
Here, if I could interject a little bit of not a little bit, a deep vein of cynicism about that comment, whether it's sincere or diverting, which one needn't even address.
Yeah.
It's always easy for countries that are struggling to say, if only, where's the Deus ex machina here? Where the great foreigner with a great mind who will come in and solve problems. Look what Google, and this is the secret of America. No. I'll be more Marxist than that. The secret of America is structural and institutional. It's a combination of free and abundant capital, mobility of labor, up till now, laws that were clear and were enforced relatively impartially, and a regulatory framework that didn't hinder, relative to other countries at least, creation. So you can take the unwashed and the poor and do fine if your structures are correct. It's not, we have the wrong immigrants. I find that, frankly, at best, a duplicitous comment to make.
Anyway, moving on from the CDU MP who's just had a drubbing to immigration. Immigration is leading to challenges in assimilation, religious radicalism, and resentment on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a political development where you have out-of-touch bureaucratic elites versus far-right populists. And Europe, in a nutshell, in our view, is going to go through a lot of strain. There'll be economic, there'll be social, there'll be cultural, there'll be political, and indeed, they very well will be racial and religious too. Over to you, Glenn. What can Europe expect in 2026?
Well, Europe. Let's broaden it a bit and to the globe, and we can say that instability will continue of political systems and societies. Perhaps we should say societies first, and then, as a result, political systems. I think this is the reality of the time we're living. So instability, I think, will rise, and the states will, as you put it, alliteratively, and I think quite well, failing, flailing, and fracturing will be the lot of us all in our states.
We are already seeing. We are already seeing Venezuela and Latin/South America. Millions have fled a corrupt and kleptocratic and oppressive regime. Nigeria cannot control the northern part of the territory. Mali and the Sahel have Islamic radicalism. The French are out. The Russians are in. Lord help Africa. Libya in North Africa is divided between warlords. Democratic Republic of Congo.
And with the French out and the Russians in, violence has increased. Fatalities have increased, instability has increased, exploitation economically has increased, concentration of wealth has increased, and the political stability has collapsed. So, great job, Russia.
Anyway, let's move on to Somaliland, where the Israelis have recognized them as separate. The US hasn't. The UAE has a port there, has a military port there. And of course, Ethiopia has an agreement to lease a part of Somaliland that will give it access to the coast. So that, watch the Horn of Africa, and that is next to Yemen, where South Yemen may declare independence. So Yemen may be fractured again. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and even Iran in the Middle East are no longer that cohesive. In fact, Lebanon was never really cohesive for a while.
Oh my God.
And Syria,
Hobbes' state of nature. It's Hobbes' state of nature. He has at last been proven correct after only 400 years. It's just
exactly.
It's unbelievable.
And we haven't even talked about Afghanistan, the gateway from Central Asia to South Asia, or the impact of the national security strategy, which we will in another long podcast in a deep dive. But America's withdrawal the arguably the end of Pax Americana is going to increase what people call volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So we will live in an age of instability. Moving on. So we've covered issue 6, Europe faces a mega polycrisis, and we have covered issue 7 in the interests of time. And now we move on to military factors, and issue 8 and issue 9 and issue 10. And issue 8 is Russia-Ukraine war comes to an end. And because we are going over time, we will get through all of them together. Issue 9, tensions turning dangerous in East Asia. And issue 10, specter of military conflict continues in the Middle East. So very quickly, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war, Glenn, tell us what's going on. There's a 20-point plan, Ukrainian plan in response to the American 28-point plan. Ukraine has dropped demands to be in NATO. It wants security guarantees from the US and Europe with an option to join the EU at a later date. But Trump wants a land for peace deal, and that is a sticking point. But he's most likely to force it down Zelensky's throat. Where does all of this lead to?
I'm afraid you're right. Well, Donald Trump, ironically, may be a peacemaker in the sense that without sustained U.S. support, it becomes substantially more difficult for Ukraine to continue the war. They can, if Europe can marshal it, organize itself enough. But if is always the large word. So the pressures are greater than ever for a solution. Russia still is not perceived, I think, accurately. I think the strains on Russia are substantially larger than certainly Putin presents the case, understandably why he would do that. But economically and structurally, Russia is feeling the strain also quite a bit. So the likelihood of some sort of a settlement is certainly much higher. I think there would not be one, and that would not be the case if Donald Trump were not pulling American support for Ukraine away. And that does give an existential, real-time choice decision that Ukraine has to work towards. So the war may come to an end, and it does look like that. It's always the case that wherever an army controls territory, political influence will then go to the country which has the army there, and that's I think largely what's shaping up. Guarantees are words. Ukraine has had them before. Many countries have had them before. It's a way to stop the fighting without paying a price by the guarantor. So it's all a dismal prospect, frankly, for Ukraine. And Russia has partially succeeded, thanks to Donald Trump, in convincing a substantial part of the world to tell itself that it will believe, whether it does or not, that there's guilt on both sides, and that Russia has some reason to make a claim other than avarice. But that's how it's shaping up. That's how it's shaping up.
Over to issue
East Asia,
9.
I'll
over to issue 9. Tensions turning dangerous in East Asia. So as we speak, yesterday's headlines were all about 10 hours of live fire exercises in Justice Mission 2025. This is China's military operations. These drills came 11 days after the US approved $11 billion arms sale to Taiwan, the biggest ever Washington-Taipei deal. On December 30, which is again yesterday, we are doing it on the last day of the year, December 31st, 2025. On December 30, People's Liberation Army's Eastern Theater Command conducted a second day of large-scale Army, Naval, Air, and Rocket Force operations around Taiwan. And this is not just to the west of Taiwan, but also to the east of Taiwan, the Japan side of Taiwan. And Donald Trump's reaction at Mar-a-Lago was, I have a great relationship with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He hasn't told me anything about the drills, and nothing worries me. Of course, the Taiwanese didn't have similar software. The Taiwanese Defense Ministry said that it detected 130 Chinese military aircraft and 14 naval vessels, basically close by. Of these 130 sorties, 90 had entered Taiwan's northern, central, and southwestern and eastern air defense identification zone, which is called ADIZ or Z if you're American. This is an early warning system to detect incursions. Obviously, Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te condemned the PLA drills and accused China of undermining regional stability through military intimidation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi criticized Taiwan's independence forces, continuous provocations. I can't see, how the Taiwanese were being provocative, but hey ho, there we go. And Japan's current leadership for openly challenging China's territorial sovereignty. Of course, he slammed the US weapons sale. Now, whilst all of this is going on, remember that China-Japan tensions have been on the rise, and I have a long piece coming out on this, 3,000 plus words. You can read all about it. But in this time, the Japanese prime minister, the first prime minister who has ridden motorcycle in a rock band, she said something in Parliament in response to a question. And basically, she said that, yes, I mean, if the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, were to attack Taiwan, that might create threatening Japan's survival. And she's made overt what Japanese diplomats, intelligence officials, and military officers have said in private, and what Shinzo Abe also said, but this was after he was prime minister. So she didn't say anything new, but she said it in parliament, she said it as prime minister, and the Chinese went berserk. They've applied economic pressure, they have applied military pressure, they have threatened hell and high water, and what we are seeing is a dangerous escalation in Japan-China tensions, or China-Japan tensions, which arguably are at their highest level since World War II. So East Asia is certainly on the boil. Over to you, Glenn. What more can we expect?
Well, it is a huge topic, but it's a little bit, we're having a tempest in a Beijing-made teapot here, except that the teapot might overflow and scald everybody, and then they'll drop the teapot, everything will break, and we'll all die. It could be, it is a very serious problem, but where is the change? As you pointed out, the change is in Beijing, and the dynamic you can summarize as follows, and this accurately describes what's happening in the larger sense. China becomes more aggressive, other countries respond, and China denounces them for becoming hostile. Well, that's really the reverse of where the driver is. The driver is in Beijing, and the crisis is not a new one. It's that there are irreconcilable conceptions of what Taiwan should be, and how states should conduct themselves in international waters. And that's it. China has quite explicitly, consciously played the nationalist card and the anti-Japanese card whenever it needs to rally support. And there's strong evidence, I think we can just say that we know, that Chinese leaders periodically have become alarmed themselves that they have created a monster that, which is nationalism, that spins beyond their control, even pressuring them to take measures that they don't want to take. Independent of that, Xi Jinping has made a central tenet of his emperorship that he will absorb Taiwan back into China. And he has progressively provided the means for China to do that and increase the pressure. It's not just that China is attacking the Japanese prime minister. It's the same dynamic that China has used since 1949, but in particular since 2012 when Xi Jinping became premier, that if you are an assistant professor in a small university someplace in the west of Australia or in Western Massachusetts, and you say something that is not in conformity with the Chinese official line, they will come after you and try to destroy you. And this is what's happening with the new prime minister. This is a crisis of Beijing's making, which is not to say that it is not a real crisis.
All right, finally, the specter of issue 10, the specter of Middle East, the specter of military conflict in the Middle East continues. Glenn, I mean, what could go wrong? Israel is dominant. The war in Gaza is over. Israel has the Golan Heights. They've destroyed the Syrian Air Force, the Syrian Navy, the Syrian army. Iran has demonstrations on its streets. What could possibly go wrong in 2026?
Well, I think I would frame it that what is likely to happen is there are tectonic shifts underway, structural shifts in alliances. I don't see it as particularly likely that there would be large-scale military events, because, as you say, Israel has no particular threat really now, other than arguably the encroaching interests and activities of an expansionist Turkey. But the change since
I mean, Glenn, the Ottomans are back. The Ottomans are back.
Right.
It took them a century, but they are back now.
That is true. Israel has lastingly diminished a conventional kind of threat, but in so doing, that sort of has freed the fetters or the ties that have bound alliances throughout the region. So now we see Saudi Arabia looking progressively and the Emirates to China. China continues to grow in influence and attractiveness from many perspectives, and the U.S. is pulling back and is not as involved. So that will be a historic shift.
I think the key thing is the implosion of different states. That's the point we made earlier. The Middle East in particular, the states are very fragile. Syria is now basically different arcs of influence of foreign powers. With Turkey's MIT, their intelligence service being particularly dominant right now in Damascus, all the way from Istanbul to Damascus. But the Alawites on the coasts, they are rebelling. The Kurds have their own enclave. The Druze have gone to the protection of Israel. Lebanon is very divided. Iraq continues to be divided. Iran is divided too. Iran has many ethnicities, and Iran has great economic pain, and thousands of people are demonstrating in the streets. Similarly, Yemen may break up into two pieces.
Again,
de
facto has. I mean, sure.
De facto has, indeed. So what the Middle East could have skirmishes or an attack or sporadic violence continue. So the specter of a violent Middle East continues as far as both of us are concerned in 2026. On that note, I think we have run over time, in fact, but we've covered a lot of ground. Those of you who want to speak about geopolitical risks and indeed opportunities in 2026, and we didn't even talk about the rise in metal prices in gold and platinum and palladium, because obviously we couldn't talk about everything. So come to us. We wish you a very happy new year. Have a wonderful 2026 despite all the dark clouds on the horizon, and we look forward to continuing our conversation then.
Godot has never yet arrived, so everything will be fine.
On that note, bye for now.
Bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.